What if I told you that the most powerful corporation in history possessed a private military force significantly larger than most sovereign nations, and accidentally invented the structural foundation of modern global capitalism just to solve a massive logistical nightmare regarding imported spices? Welcome to Money's Hidden Past. Rich people lied, we fact-checked. Today we are stripping down the legendary Dutch East India Company and exposing exactly how a single corporate entity conquered the world. Before the year 1602, the global maritime trade was terrifying. Sending a wooden merchant ship across the violent oceans to Eastern Asia was the financial equivalent of placing your entire family life savings on a single blind spin of an incredibly dangerous casino roulette wheel. If the ship successfully returned loaded with highly valuable nutmeg and pepper, the merchant who funded the voyage became a millionaire overnight. But if the heavy wooden hull was swallowed by a seasonal storm or captured by ruthless pirates, the merchant was instantly bankrupted. This massive financial barrier to entry was crippling the open market. Only the absolute richest aristocrats could even afford to play the game, meaning the supply of incredibly lucrative spices was artificially bottlenecked, while the massive demand from wealthy European consumers continued to skyrocket. The brilliant merchants of Amsterdam recognized this catastrophic economic failure. They realized that the financial risk of losing an entire wooden merchant ship was simply too incredibly high for any single human being to comfortably carry. So they engineered an unprecedented financial workaround, known simply as slicing the risk instead of forcing one incredibly wealthy merchant to fund a single ship. They opened the financial doors and allowed everyday common working class citizens to purchase tiny fractional shares of a massive combined global trading fleet, which accidentally triggered the historical birth of the modern corporate machine. If a violent storm destroyed one specific ship in the brand new fleet, the collective investors only lost a tiny microscopic percentage of their total portfolio because the other massive ships in the corporate armada survived the dangerous journey, returning home safely with enough valuable cargo to generate a collective profit. This incredibly simple mathematical concept completely rewired the entire human race. It formally established the Dutch East India Company as a ruthless global titan, and brought three massive economic breakthroughs directly into the modern historical timeline that would permanently form the undeniable structural bedrock of modern corporate capitalism. The first unprecedented breakthrough was the powerful legal concept of limited liability. Before this invention, investing your cash in a commercial business was dangerous because if the business failed and accumulated a massive amount of toxic debt, the angry creditors could legally seize your personal house and your private savings. The Dutch government granted the brand new corporate monopoly a special legal protection, dictating that if the massive corporate fleet somehow went entirely bankrupt, an individual retail investor would only lose the small amount they invested. Their personal family home and their external private wealth were legally protected. This legal shield of limited liability completely removed the psychological fear of total ruin, convincing thousands of average local bakers, blacksmiths, and neighborhood farmers to empty their life savings and eagerly hand the cash to the company, creating an unstoppable tsunami of investment capital violently flowing directly into Amsterdam, which directly accelerated the second major breakthrough known as the Megacorporation. By strategically pooling tiny amounts of liquid cash from thousands of ordinary people, the Dutch East India Company built an absolutely staggering private financial war chest, far bigger and significantly more dangerous than what any single global king could afford. They used this massive mountain of public cash to build heavily armed merchant ships, hiring thousands of ruthless mercenary soldiers to violently protect their lucrative trade, transforming a simple merchant logistics business into a towering military superpower capable of toppling sovereign governments and violently colonizing distant foreign islands. But the third massive historical breakthrough was perhaps the most fascinatingly accidental. A wooden voyage from Amsterdam to the distant shores of modern-day Indonesia would routinely take several extremely dangerous and unpredictable years to fully complete meaning. The eager retail investors had their cash completely locked away for years. If a local investor experienced a sudden severe medical emergency at their home, they simply could not wait 3 long years for the ships to safely return. They desperately needed a reliable financial mechanism to get their physical cash out early without entirely disrupting the massive global operations of the corporate trading fleet. People slowly started independently selling their paper company shares to other local citizens, trading their fractional ownership of the fleet for immediate and highly necessary physical cash. They gathered eagerly in the bustling outdoor courtyards of the wealthy Dutch capital, officially creating the very first functional iteration of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. For the first time in the entire long historical arc of human civilization, people were aggressively trading abstract paper representations of potential future wealth, betting heavily on the mathematical success or failure of a massive corporate enterprise, and giving birth to the exact financial market system we still utilize today, But the most fascinating aspect of this incredibly powerful global monopoly was that it was absolutely never run by a royal king or sovereign queen. It was entirely controlled by a ruthless board of 17 corporate directors, historically and terrifyingly known simply as the Lords 17. They were highly calculated delegates representing the absolute wealthiest Dutch cities, operating safely and comfortably out of their lavish boardrooms in the Netherlands. They made absolutely all the high-level strategic global decisions for the company, acting as the supreme untouchable rulers of an entirely privatized commercial empire. The Lords 17 possessed the supreme legal authority to officially declare war. They could execute prisoners, violently negotiate treaties, and mint their own physical currency. They systematically monopolized the entire global supply of nutmeg cloves and cinnamon, and they violently destroyed absolutely anyone who dared to challenge their market dominance for over 150 years. They dominated the entire global economy, employing over 1 million people across their vast global network of operational outposts and commanding a massive private fleet of nearly 5,000 heavily armed ships, creating a corporate footprint that has never been truly equaled in modern history. They did not simply arrive at distant foreign ports and politely ask to trade. They aggressively conquered entire island nations and enslaved the local indigenous populations, using their massive private military to ruthlessly enforce strict production quotas and executing anyone who dared to sell spices to a competing global empire. This level of absolute unchecked corporate violence generated unprecedented institutional profits, allowing the directors to manipulate the entire European consumer economy, making the massive modern technology giants look like disorganized neighborhood businesses, and completely rewriting the geopolitical map of the 17th century. But like every single massive empire built entirely on ruthless corporate greed, the towering Dutch East India Company was mathematically destined to tragically fall. They were incredibly powerful on the outside, but slowly and silently decaying from within, eventually collapsing under a deeply toxic combination of executive arrogance and structural rot. Despite successfully operating the most profitable global monopoly in human history, the company officially declared total bankruptcy and was nationalized by the desperate Dutch government in the year 1799, a spectacular systemic failure, driven directly by massive, uncontrolled corporate corruption. The very first fatal flaw was a culture of rampant and unstoppable global smuggling, because the incredibly wealthy corporate board was notoriously and violently cheap. They paid their sailors and global administrators terrible starvation wages while demanding their total absolute loyalty in incredibly dangerous and hostile environments to physically survive the brutal reality of their terrible corporate compensation. The employees aggressively traded spices on the side for their own private profit, packing their small personal sea chests with stolen corporate inventory and selling the stolen goods quietly on the highly lucrative black markets of Europe. This internal theft violently drained so much wealth from the master corporate ledger that the working citizens of the Netherlands started making a highly cynical local joke. They claimed the famous company initials actually stood for a completely different phrase translating to perished under corruption in the native historical Dutch language. But the thieving sailors were not the ones who mathematically destroyed the company. The ultimate fatal blow came directly from the arrogant boardroom of the Lords 17, who completely fell into the absolute deadliest trap of modern public financial markets: the desperate and suicidal corporate need to maintain a massive investor dividend to keep their thousands of public shareholders blindly happy and fiercely loyal. The board of directors insisted on paying out incredibly high annual cash dividends, even when the massive fleet was actively losing money on disastrous global voyages, a strategy that completely defies the fundamental logic of double-entry bookkeeping. When the corporate vault did not have the physical cash to pay the dividend, the executives simply borrowed massive amounts of highly expensive sovereign debt, using the borrowed money to artificially inflate the payments to the eager investors, creating a massive systemic mathematical illusion of endless corporate profitability. They were essentially running a massive state-sponsored corporate pyramid scheme, borrowing heavily against their future operations to pay for their past promises, refusing to admit to the public that their profit margins were violently shrinking and destroying their balance sheet to proudly protect their executive egos, while the Dutch company was slowly suffocating under massive toxic debt. Their primary global rival was aggressively and brilliantly modernizing their strategy. The British East India Company was quietly building a significantly stronger military navy and ruthlessly overhauling their entire global corporate operational strategy. The Dutch had heavily specialized in the incredibly lucrative global spice trade, building their entire economic foundation on the control of nutmeg and black pepper. But consumer tastes in Europe were rapidly and permanently shifting away from spices, meaning the absolute structural foundation of the Dutch monopoly was losing value. The British completely recognized this massive shift and pivoted their entire operation. They heavily shifted their corporate focus toward highly profitable new consumer markets, aggressively importing massive quantities of imported tea and woven textile fabrics, leaving the rigid Dutch completely stuck holding a rapidly declining global asset. The ultimate breaking point arrived violently during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when the powerful British Royal Navy blockaded the coastal European ports, preventing the massive, heavily loaded Dutch spice fleets from successfully returning home, and immediately cutting off the vital cash flow required to service their massive debt. Without the ability to physically sell their spices on the open global market, the incredibly fragile financial illusion of the Lords. 17 completely shattered, the massive corporate giant was mathematically exposed as an empty hollow shell, triggering a complete total panic on the very stock exchange. They had originally invented, the British corporation completely outmaneuvered them militarily and economically, slowly bleeding the Dutch out of the absolute most profitable colonial trade routes, until the massive mountain of accumulated dividend debt finally crushed the Dutch executives, forcing the national government to step in and absorb the ruins of the Megacorporation. The spectacular collapse of the Dutch East India Company is a terrifying historical warning. It absolutely proves that no corporate entity is ever simply too big to fail, and that a financial system built entirely on the blind pursuit of shareholder dividends will always eventually collapse under the crushing and undeniable weight of mathematical reality. The rich people in the modern executive suites want you to completely believe that their massive global monopolies are permanent fixtures of human society. But history mathematically proves that when you squeeze your workers for pure profit and artificially inflate your stock price with massive amounts of borrowed corporate debt, you're simply building a highly volatile financial bomb inside your own headquarters. The exact same arrogant corporate strategies that destroyed the historical Lords. 17. Are still actively being used by the massive multinational corporations operating today because the executives know they will get paid long before the ship actually sinks. They invented the public stock market to spread the severe financial risk to the working class, but they kept the absolute massive corporate profits completely and entirely for themselves. A brilliantly manipulative structural system that survived the collapse of the company and became the absolute permanent historical blueprint for the modern global economy. If this deep dive into the massive historical illusion of the Dutch East India Company and the terrifying reality of how modern corporate capitalism was actually engineered fired you up about understanding the literal mathematical foundation of the global economy, then do me a massive favor right now. Smash that like button to let the algorithm know this factual historical conversation matters. Share this video with every friend and family member who needs to understand how the real financial world operates. Let us keep exposing the true mechanics of wealth and power. I will catch you in the next one, where we break down the next hidden chapter in the long history of money and corporate authority. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical, and remember that sometimes the biggest lies in the modern financial world are the exact same ones they were telling in the year 1602.